we've dealt a bit with the changing language of Thailand and the way in which changes in language, there was a relationship between linguistic changes and changes in ethnicity. And we compared some of the changes that have gone on in Thailand with some of the developments in Malaysia, where immigrant communities, after a few generations, no longer speak the original language of their parents and grandparents, and as they assimilate into life in their new country, they, having changed languages, they become happier to be just known as Malays. And what is true in present-day Malaysia is also true in Thailand. Some ethnic minorities, because of Thai assimilationist policies, particularly language. In the past, assimilationist policies had to do with dress as well and customs, but these days the singularly most important element of ethnic identity that has been influenced by Bangkok relates to language, and we'll talk more about language and ethnicity later on. But let's have a look at South Thailand. And as you all know, South Thailand for over a decade now, for over 14 years, has been in its most recent chapter of what has been called a ethnic conflict, or an ethno-religious conflict, or an ethno-linguistic conflict, as I would say. But a conflict is primarily a political thing. Violence is a political tool. And so, but what I would like to do, you've probably heard a number of analyses of conflict dynamics in Thailand. You will be aware that since the end of the Second World War, it is common to talk about conflicts inside nation states between different ethnic groups to be generically or more generally referred to as an ethnic conflict. And so what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to re-look at South Thailand and of conflict in South Thailand, and to ask about whether this is an ethno-linguistic conflict or an ethno-religious conflict. And so the pictures that we'll go into full screen now so that we can see the maps in a bit more detail. And so I have two maps here, and on my left-hand side you will see a map, and it shows in red, it shows the parts of the south where there has been most highest numbers of violent incidences. And we'll see that they are concentrated around Sungai Padi in the south, around Ranget, Jo'airong further north, and then in Resort, and then Banang Sata, and then around Yala town, which has got a large concentration. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a map which approximates where Malay language use is strongest. And we'll see that there is a lot in Narathiwat, and we will see those maps there. Now, We do need to, it is most common for people, particularly in the post 9/11 world, to assume that when there is a conflict and one of the people involved in this conflict are Muslims, that this is primarily a religious conflict, a religious war. And so I'll be talking a bit about the problems with thinking about that. But we need to we need to remind ourselves right from the start that any conflict is complex, that there is almost always more than one factor that contributes to conflict coming about. There is more than one cause, more than one grievance needs to be present for there to be conflict. And so I'm arguing in this lecture that language is an important causal factor. But even though I am particularly interested in language, there are many other reasons why this conflict, which is most commonly referred to as an ethnic conflict or an ethno-religious conflict, that there are indeed lots and lots of other causes for Malays, some members of the Malay population to be resisting the government. Now, I am particularly interested in examining Malay language loyalty and language loss and angst or worry about language loss. But the wider context of this part of Thailand are historical grievances about the annexation and the brutal treatment of the former semi-independent Malay Sultanate of Patani at the hands of Siam, particularly in the early Bangkok period. Now, this population, this Malay population, this Malay polity in the south, is not the only group in Thailand that has got historic grievances against Bangkok. And we know about the importance of the Lao and the northern grievances, if you know anything about Thai history. The wider context in South Thailand is one of poverty and underdevelopment. Malays in South Thailand have, on average, lower incomes than elsewhere in the country. There is widespread social disintegration, delinquency and drug use in South Thailand. There are uncivil Muslims as well as uncivil and violent Buddhists. Both of these exist, so violence is widespread in Thailand. Thailand has one of the largest murder rates in the world, around the same level as the Philippines. There are low education choices and achievement. The general, in Thailand generally, bureaucracy is chaotic and largely corrupt, and there is rising Thai Buddhist ethno-religious nationalism. And so Muslims do not have a monopoly on violence. Violence is something which happens wherever you find humans. And from what we are seeing in Sri Lanka and what we are seeing in Myanmar, that Buddhist-led violence is is a wide phenomenon. So multi-causality in Thailand. We're thinking specifically about the role of language in conflicts, but I think because most people consider that religion is a primary cause of conflict, I do think that it is good for us to remind ourselves of the similarities and differences between language and religion. And so when we speak more than one language, and when we are a member of a religious community, that increases our mobility. We can communicate with people when we speak more than one language, and sometimes our religion allows us to have connections with people elsewhere. We have something in common with them, even though we may be different ethnically. These are very common identity markers. People will demonstrate that they are different, not only because of the food they eat and the clothes they eat, but because of the language they speak and their religious traditions. Language complement other ethnic markers. We often talk about Thai Buddhists and Malay Muslims and Chinese Christians. And so this is very common. And sometimes we have a very instrumentalist motivation for learning a language or converting to a religion. If we learn a language, we get access to a better education. If we convert to a religion, we are able to enter into a specific class. They are crucial. Language and religion are crucial for establishing empathy and increasing understanding. When you speak more than one language and are familiar with more than one religion, empathy and understanding increase. But language and religion are very different. A government cannot have governments may accept the reality of religious pluralism, but few governments have a multilingual language policy. So governments that accept and give religious freedom very rarely can give freedom and rights to all religions. Languages change gradually. It is a difficult thing to learn a new language, and when you lose a language, unfortunately the loss of that language is, although it may take time, it will be permanent. In terms of religious change can happen far more faster. It takes less effort to practice a new religious tradition than it does to learn a new language. And generally speaking, religious change doesn't happen as often. Multilingualism is the norm, but bi-religious identity is rare. Linguistic defectors, people who no longer learn languages, are not often punished, but in some religious traditions, apostates are punished. And religious forces can be easily mobilized through mosques and temples and churches, imams and monks. But languages are not very powerful mobilizers. And so we've looked at this We've looked at this map a number of times, and I'm just wanting to introduce this again to remind ourselves of a number of things. That, first of all, the maps here compare modern-day Thailand just in isolation, whereas the map on the left shows that there are some language groups on one side of the border which move into another side of the border. And why is it that Malays in the south some Malays in the south are interested in independence and others want to succeed and join Malaysia? Why is it that we have large linguistic minorities of Karen in the north and significant populations of Mon in the central part and the upper south of Thailand, and we have large numbers of northern Khmer? This map doesn't show the Lao-speaking populations because they are Thai, part of the Thai family. But the point here is that we have the dynamics of ethnic conflict, and specifically the agenda to secede, and to annex a part of present-day Thailand and add it to Myanmar, or for there to be an independent country. It involves language, but it's more than language. The Northern Khmer in Thailand, the Mon in Thailand, the Karen in Thailand generally do not want to leave Thailand and join the Mon state and the Karen state and modern-day Cambodia, because the standard of living is higher in Thailand. However, in the south, there are a number of dynamics that are unique, and the most important are that in Thailand, Malays are both a religious and a linguistic minority, and that in Malaysia, the Malays are a religious majority, a linguistic majority. The official language is Malay in Malaysia, and the official religion is Islam. But more importantly, that Malays in Malaysia are financially more prosperous. And so, although language does play a part, there are other factors involved as well. We've looked at this before, and I don't need to labour this point, that language defection is widespread in the country, and even though it is widespread not only in the north, the northeast, and in South Thailand, where Khmer and Mon and Lao and other minority languages are less spoken, and they are more Thai speaking. In the south, the regional concentration of Malay speakers is bordering on Malaysia, and so this situation is very, very different. When we think about language and conflict, we also have to remember that language use in South Thailand, Malay language use, and Thai language use in South Thailand is highly gendered. Not only is the amount of Malay spoken in South Thailand, it depends on whether you live in a rural area or an urban area, but generally speaking, more women speak Thai and are more comfortably bilingual in Malay and Thai than Malay men. And related to that, Malay men are more involved in violence. I want to introduce the concept of language grief. And this is a schema which has been put together by William Bostock, who has analysed ethnic violence and specifically the role of ethno-linguistic dynamics in violence. And so he compares the mother tongue to our mother. And so there are two basic sorts of language grief, and one is resolved and one is unresolved. And so the first type of language grief is a language grief which basically says this: our mother or our mother tongue is dying or has died of natural causes. And that kind of language grief would represent the attitude of many Muslims in Thailand who live in Bangkok and in the Upper South. Their grandparents, their great-grandparents may have read Jawi, they may have spoken Malay, but no one has spoken Malay for 2 or 3 or 4 generations. The language is dead. We speak Thai now. And the language has died of natural causes. So that's the first sort of language grief. The second sort of language grief is also resolved. Our mother tongue is gravely ill but receiving appropriate treatment. Okay, so the language is not dead, but we are all committed to keeping it alive, and so we do not need to be worried. However, there is an unresolved form of language grief. One is internalized, the other is externalized. Our mother tongue was murdered, and we ourselves have lost the will to live. So there has been a bad thing that has happened, and we admit defeat. But the other is more externalized. Our mother tongue was murdered, and the murderers are still living in our house, and because of that, it is time that we fought. So, there is an article written by a number of, I think, Norwegian scholars, and it's led by Borman, and they look at this issue of language and religion and ethnic civil war. And what they did is they compared a whole pile of different conflicts, and they looked at the role of ethnicity, language, and religion. And for example, between Hausa and Fulani and the Urubá, there have been a number of conflicts between these. And in all of these groups, for instance, the Urubá, some of them are Muslims, some of them are Anglicans, and some of them are other Christians, including Catholics and other Protestant groups. And amongst the Urubá, despite the fact that they have different religious affiliations, they all speak the same language. There are other incidences where Fulani groups and Hausa groups, all of whom are Muslims, have had conflicts between them primarily because they speak different languages. Now let's just consider for a minute that you have got 2 neighbours. On one side is a neighbour who is of a different religion to you but speaks the same language as you. On the other side, you have someone who has a different religion and a different language. Now, if you were going to have a conflict with someone, perhaps one of your neighbours because of something that had happened with the neighbourhood, what is the most likely reason for you to have conflict? Is it because of religious differences or because of the inability to understand each other or a lack of willingness to speak the same language? And so this is one of the summaries, and you'll see here that the solid dot is differences in religion and differences in language, and you'll see that in the West is a place where there are least conflicts. Eastern Europe, a lot of conflict. Asia, a lot of conflict. And you'll see that it is that compared to religion in Asia and in Eastern Europe, most ethnic conflicts are primarily due to differences in language, not religion. And these are some interesting, very, very interesting findings. Okay, so let's go out of full screen now. And so we often talk very generically, very generally about ethnic conflict. And sometimes, and this is, sometimes it is helpful for us to be a bit more specific and to be talking about ethno-religious and ethno-linguistic conflicts. When most Thais and most outsiders think about South Thailand, because one of the parties involved are Muslims, and we are living in a world following 9/11 where most people assume that if a Muslim group is involved in violence, then they have religious motivations. My argument is that in South Thailand, which is like all conflicts is complex, that some of the most important but understudied factors in this conflict actually have very little to do with religious dynamics. Religion is a very powerful motivator. You can make claims of the legitimacy of fighting for religious causes. These are a lot more common than using linguistic reasons. But despite that, it is primarily linguistic differences between Malays and Thais that have contributed to this. Why is it that no Thai-speaking Muslims are actively involved in this struggle? If it was a religious issue, surely there would be Thai Muslims from elsewhere in the country actively involved. Now, some may be involved, but they are a very small number. This is primarily because that one of the most important differences in Islam, in Malay Islam in South Thailand, is the allegiance, the loyalty to the Malay language, which, like almost all linguistic minorities in Thailand, the Thai government does not have a clear affirmative action policy towards. So the status of Malay in the south is the same as Khmer, the same as Chinese, the same as Lao, the same as Karen and other linguistic minorities. So this is one of the many ways that we could introduce talking about ethnic conflict. Ethnic conflict in Thailand, we need to pay attention to the role of language, not just religion.